Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're continuing our lessons in verse 4. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw the first part of last lesson, it says, but if any widow have children or nephews, we saw that the Greek word for nephews actually means grandchildren. So if any widow have children or grandchildren, let them, meaning the children or the grandchildren, let them learn first to show piety. That means respect at home. And at home here means that they are to respect their parents or their grandparents, especially the widows. And then it says, and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now, as we get into this word requite, this is where we begin this lesson. It says here, and so the children and the grandchildren are to show piety. That means have a respect for their parents and grandparents, have a respect for them at home, and to requite their parents. Now, the Greek phrase for requite is amoibos apodidomai. And apodidomai means to render or to give. And amoibos means recompense. So amoibos apodidomai means to pay back or to recompense. And it carries the idea that of the sense of us as children or grandchildren paying back our parents for all that they have done for us in our lifetime. Now, first off, your parents generally don't want you to pay them back. And secondly, you don't have the means to pay them back for how many years? 18, 20 years of all the things that they've done for you. I know even my wife says to our children, do you know how many times I've washed your clothes and your bed sheets and cleaned your room? And how many diapers I've changed, right? The dishes that I've washed and all these things. And we've been told that. I'm sure you've heard that many times from your parents. I know I heard it a number of times from my parents also. And the idea is that they have done so much for us. And yet many times we take it very lightly. And, when we grow a little bit older and we think to ourselves, we mature in our mind a little bit more, and we take time to think about how much our parents have done for us, and we think of all the time and that they have put into our lives, taking us to school or taking us to sports or all the investment that they have given to us. It's not possible for us to ever monetarily pay them back, and they wouldn't want it anyways. And if you're a parent, you understand that you don't really want your children to pay you back. Basically, the only payment that a parent really wants is simply to be appreciated and to be respected for what they've done. And I know myself and my wife with our children, we don't want them to pay us back, but we just want to be appreciated and respected for what we have done for them. And usually your appreciation and respect is going to have to wait a while, because children don't need to grow up to understand how to appreciate and respect their parents for all that they've done. They want to be loved by their children, and their children to be good kids. I mean, we all want our children to love us and to grow up as good kids. And if we are Christian parents, then most of all, first and foremost, we want our children to grow up knowing the Lord and having a relationship with God. That's the most important thing, and it's very rewarding for Christian parents if their children can grow up knowing the Lord and putting God first in their life. And that's what we want. I mean, that's what all parents want, whether they're saved parents or not. They just want to be appreciated and respected for all that they've done for their children. So he says here, let the children or grandchildren, let them learn first to show respect at home to their parents and grandparents, and to requite their parents, to pay them back with honor and respect and appreciation for all that they've done. And then to finish off this verse, it says, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now, some scholars have it where it says, for that is acceptable before God. They don't have the phrase, for it is good and. They leave out the good and. It's, for it is acceptable before God. Now, the Greek word before means in the sight of. So, when children and grandchildren have a healthy respect for their widows and grandparents, it's acceptable in the sight of God. It's held in honor in God's sight. Taking care of widows in your family and other family members is not only the proper duty of the family, but God is pleased with what he sees. God's pleased with it when he's pleased with it when he sees children and grandchildren honoring and respecting their parents and grandparents. All right. And it's not only just the widows in context. It's also widowers. Maybe the wife died and the husband is left alone. The father or grandfather is left alone. Maybe he's too old to work and he can't anymore. But that does not mean that he should not be respected and honored for what he has done. So now in verse 5 it says, now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. It says, now she that is a widow indeed. And this phrase is contrasting the widow of verse 4 with the widow of verse 5. The widow of verse 4 is a woman who has children and grandchildren, who has people to take care of her. But the widow of verse 5, as we saw in verse 3, it says, honor widows that are widows indeed. Now, verse 5 says, now she that is a widow indeed. The widow of verse 3 and verse 5 is a woman who has no one to take care of her. No children, no husband, no grandchildren, maybe not even relatives, close relatives to take care of her. She is a widow indeed. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate. Now, the Greek word for desolate is manao, and it's in the passive voice. And manao means to leave alone or to be left alone. Passive voice means that she received the action of being left alone. She didn't produce being left alone. She lived her life and she was left alone in her life. If she had children, then like Naomi, they had already died and possibly no close relatives willing to help. So it means that this woman lived her life, and she may have gotten married, may have had children, but this life has caused her to be left alone. Life has left her alone. That's what it's difficult for me to convey what I'm trying to get across to you, but after, let's say she's 60 years old, at 60 years old, all that this life has given to her is that now she is left alone. And then it says here, she that is a widow indeed and desolate, she's got nothing now. She trusts in God, and she continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Now, what are two important things that a widow does? And they are trusting in God and continuing in prayers and supplications night and day. And we'll get into those next lesson, all right? But until then, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.